Hey, well, good morning, Veritas Upper School. This is Mr. Gene here with you on Monday, April the 6th, bringing you our chapel message from Acts chapter 25. Now, Acts 25 is an interesting passage. We're continuing on in the story of Paul. Paul, of course, has been in prison for a while now. And up to this point, he's been in prison under the care of the Roman governor Felix. And right at the end of chapter 24, we kind of get the sense that Felix senses that Paul is innocent, that he realizes Paul hasn't really broken any Roman laws, and yet he wanted to do the Jews a favor. So rather than releasing Paul, he ends up leaving him in prison for another 2 years, which is kind of a bummer for Paul. And then we get to chapter 25 and we find out that Felix is on the way out and a new governor is coming in, a guy named Festus. And Festus actually begins, or Luke begins telling this account with Festus in Jerusalem. And the religious leaders are there and they bring up Paul and they're like, hey, this guy, he's up in Caesarea. We think he's guilty. And we'd like you to bring him back here to Jerusalem and let's get him tried here. And Luke tells us that the reason they wanted to bring Paul back to Jerusalem was to ambush him on the way and kill him. Well, Festus doesn't realize that, but he also doesn't want to do it in Jerusalem. He says, well, no, I'm going up to Caesarea here in a couple days anyway. You guys come with me and we'll do it there. And so that's what they do. And so they get up to Caesarea. Festus comes out, they have the trial, and Festus himself is surprised because he's like, I thought they were going to bring some really serious charges against Paul the way they were talking, and what he realizes is what Felix had realized, is that Paul hasn't broken any Roman laws, he hasn't done anything that's worthy of him being arrested or being sentenced to anything, and so but he's still not sure what to do. We're told again he's new. He doesn't want to upset the Jews, and so he's not sure what to do. So Paul pretty clearly doesn't trust Festus. He doesn't want to leave his fate in Festus's hands, and so he appeals to Caesar, which is kind of like appealing to the Supreme Court. He said, "I want to go all the way to the top." That meant that Paul would have had to go on to Rome in order to be before Caesar, but it was the right of every Roman citizen to ask for that, and so Paul asks for that to happen, to go ahead and go to Rome and to get Caesar. And Festus says, yeah, that's fine. You can have him. And then in the second half of 25, we kind of get set up for chapter 26 because King Agrippa comes on the scene. Now, King Agrippa is Herod Agrippa II, and he has just become king right around the same time that Festus has become the governor. And so King Agrippa comes in, and Festus says, hey, I've got this prisoner. It's kind of all about Jewish religious stuff, and I don't understand. He's like, but you would understand it. Why don't you listen to the case and hear kind of what's going on? And King Agrippa says, yeah, I'd like to hear the case. And that's where we end at 25, and then in chapter 26, Paul ends up giving his defense before King Agrippa. Now, as we think about, well, how does this apply to our lives? What does God maybe have to say to us in Acts 25? Remember that Acts is a largely descriptive book. It's not prescriptive for the most part, so it's just describing what happened. And so in Acts 25, there's not anything that's particularly noteworthy or this is a really clear way it applies to us. And yet, I do think there are a couple of things for us, particularly in our day. Because I think when you take a step back and you're looking at the whole picture here, and it's like, okay, God, what's going on? Like, here's Paul, the greatest missionary we have, greatest church planter we have, and he's locked up in prison for the last 2 years. And it's unjust, and it's not right, but it's the case, right? And Felix knew he was innocent, but he wouldn't release him. And then Festus knows he's innocent, but he won't release him. And Paul's going to end up having to go all the way to Rome, and he's going to be in prison for several more years before he's going to get released. And it's just kind of a question of, God, what are you doing? What are you doing right now? And it's not always clear. And I think we're in a situation like that right now with COVID-19 and the way that our lives have been altered so significantly. And it's, in one sense, it's like, well, God, what are you doing? We know from the Bible that God is doing something. He is caring about his plans. He is working out his will. But like Paul, we might not be able to see it right here in the moment. But I think we can read stories like this, and we see Paul and we see his life and ministry, and that allows us to understand that God is always at work, even if it's not clear, even if it's not obvious. We know that God is always at work. He is always doing something. Paul got to share the gospel with some of the most important people in the Roman Empire at that time, with these governors, and then with King Agrippa. And eventually he's going to get an audience with Caesar himself. How does he do that? Well, he only gets it by being arrested, in addition to many other things that the Lord does, that Paul writes many letters that are going to become scripture while he's imprisoned, among other things. And so, on the one hand, it's not to say that prison was great or that it was some vacation for Paul, but it is to say that God is at work all the time, even if we can't always see it, even if we always don't understand it. And so, as we're right now in this season where we have our own difficulties, our own trials, and tough circumstances that we're working through, let's remember that God always has a plan, that He's always at work, that His will be accomplished no matter what, and that we can trust, just like Paul, we can trust in God wherever it takes us, or in our case, wherever it doesn't take us, with our stay-at-home orders and self-quarantine right now. But we can trust that our God is at work. We can continue to put our faith in Him. All right, well, let's do that today, Veritas. I will see some of you here in just a little bit for class. And for the rest of you, I look forward to the day when we will be able to meet together again in person. Hope you have a good rest of the day at school.